The wind howls like a restless spirit. The sea churns beneath a sky heavy with storm clouds, and a ship, long, sleek, and crowned with a snarling dragon's head, plunges through the waves. This isn't a scene from a fantasy epic. This is history. Centuries before Columbus set sail, Norse explorers braved the open ocean, their voyages carrying them to a land they called Vinland, what we now know as North America. Imagine the courage it took to sail into the unknown, guided only by the stars, the sun, and the whispers of sagas passed down through generations. These weren't just warriors or raiders, they were pioneers, pushing the boundaries of the known world in ways that would remain hidden from history books for hundreds of years. What if everything you thought you knew about the discovery of America was only part of the story? The truth is, the Vikings didn't just raid and trade. They explored, settled, and left behind clues that would one day rewrite our understanding of the past. From the enigmatic ruins at Elance Orks Meadows in Newfoundland to the ancient Norse sagas that speak of distant shores, the evidence is undeniable. But how did they do it? What drove them to risk everything for a journey into the unknown? And why, for so long, did their achievements fade into myth? This isn't just a tale of exploration, it's a mystery, a puzzle waiting to be pieced together, and it's more thrilling than any fiction. Today, we're setting sail into this incredible story, uncovering the secrets of the Viking voyages to America. We'll explore the archaeological finds that prove their presence, decode the sagas that hint at their journeys, and grapple with the lingering questions that keep historians awake at night. This isn't just about the past, it's about how we understand discovery, resilience, and the human spirit. So join me as we step into the world of these daring Norse explorers and discover how they reached a continent centuries before anyone else. The adventure begins now. The Viking Age wasn't just a period of raids and battles, it was an era of unprecedented exploration, fueled by ingenuity and ambition. Picture Scandinavia in the 8th century, fjords teeming with sleek longships, their hulls carved from sturdy oak, their sails catching the wind like wings. These vessels were masterpieces of engineering, capable of navigating both open ocean and shallow rivers, giving the Norse unmatched mobility. But ships alone didn't propel them across the Atlantic. Behind every voyage lay a web of motivations, some practical, some deeply human. Overpopulation in Scandinavia's narrow valleys pushed young warriors and farmers to seek new horizons. Fertile land was scarce, and inheritance customs often left younger sons with nothing. For them, the unknown held more promise than the familiar. Then there was trade, the lifeblood of Viking society. From the silver markets of Baghdad to the fur-rich forests of Russia, Norse traders spanned continents. But the West beckoned with rumors of untouched lands, where timber and furs could be claimed without competition. Yet curiosity might have been the most powerful force. The Norse weren't just opportunists, they were storytellers, their sagas filled with tales of distant shores and strange wonders. When explorers like Eric the Red were exiled, they didn't just flee, they sailed farther, driven by a mix of necessity and sheer audacity. Greenland's icy coasts, then Vinland's gentle bays, became chapters in a saga of human tenacity. And let's not forget the role of technology. The sun, compass, the stars, even the behavior of birds, all were tools in the Viking navigator's kit. They read the ocean like a map, their knowledge passed down through generations. This wasn't blind luck, it was the culmination of centuries of seafaring wisdom. So when they finally spotted the coast of North America, it wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of skill, courage, and an unshakable drive to see what lay beyond the horizon. Leif Erikson wasn't just another Viking, he was a man shaped by exile, adventure, and a family legacy as vast as the open sea. Born to Erik the Red, the fiery-tempered founder of Greenland's Norse settlements, Leif grew up hearing stories of distant lands and the perils of the unknown. His father's banishment from Iceland for murder had forced the family into uncharted territory, and that spirit of resilience would define Leif's own path. But while Erik was a rebel, Leif was a strategist. He didn't just stumble upon Vinland, he sought it out, turning a wrong turn into one of history's greatest discoveries. The sagas tell us Leif's journey began with a twist of fate. On a return trip from Norway, where he'd converted to Christianity under King Olaf's influence, his ship was blown off course, a common hazard in an era when navigation relied on the whims of wind and wave. But instead of panicking, Leif seized the opportunity. He'd heard whispers of land to the west, sightings by another Norse explorer named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who'd glimpsed unfamiliar shores years earlier but hadn't bothered to land. Leif wasn't content with glimpses. He bought Bjarni's ship, assembled a crew, and set out to explore what others had ignored. What they found was a coastline so lush it seemed like a gift from the gods. Vinland, as Leif called it, offered everything Greenland lacked: thick forests for building, wild grapes for wine, and meadows ripe for grazing. The sagas describe a place almost too good to be true, where the dew on the grass tasted as sweet as honey. For a people dependent on scarce resources, this was paradise. Leif built temporary shelters, possibly at what we now call Elance Orks Meadows, and his crew overwintered there, marveling at the mild climate compared to Greenland's icy grip. But Vinland wasn't empty. The Norse called the indigenous people they encountered Skraelings, a term layered with both fascination and tension. Trade initially flourished Norse cloth for animal pelts, but clashes soon followed. The sagas hint at misunderstandings, cultural divides, and ultimately violence that made sustained settlement impossible. Leif's brother Thorvald would later die in one of these skirmishes, an arrow lodged in his side. It's a reminder that this wasn't just a story of exploration. It was a collision of worlds with all the complexity and tragedy that entailed. What makes Leif's voyage so remarkable isn't just that he reached North America, it's that he did it with purpose. He wasn't a lost raider or a desperate exile. He was a calculated explorer, mapping routes, assessing resources, and laying groundwork for others to follow. The Norse may not have stayed in Vinland long, but they left behind proof of their presence: iron nails, wooden artifacts, and the outlines of turf houses that would sit undisturbed for centuries. Leif's story blurs the line between history and legend, but the evidence whispers something undeniable. Half a millennium before Columbus, a Viking stood on these shores, and the world was bigger than anyone had dreamed. The Icelandic sagas are more than just epic tales, they're time capsules, preserving fragments of history in layers of myth and memory. Among these, the Vinland sagas stand out as our most vivid window into the Norse expeditions to North America. Two key texts, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Erik the Red, weave together accounts of storm-tossed voyages, encounters with indigenous peoples, and fleeting settlements in a land they called Vinland. But here's the fascinating puzzle. These sagas weren't written as dry historical records. They were oral traditions, passed down for generations before being transcribed centuries later. So how do we separate fact from folklore? Take the descriptions of Vinland itself, a place where rivers teemed with salmon and wild wheat grew tall. At first glance, it sounds like a Norse version of paradise. But when archaeologists uncovered the remains of butternuts and grapevines at Elance Orks Meadows, it matched the saga's claims of a milder climate further south. Even the mention of Skrælings, the Norse term for indigenous inhabitants, aligns with evidence of contact between Vikings and the Thule people or Dorset cultures. These weren't just imaginative details, they were grounded in real experiences, yet the sagas aren't perfect records. They contradict each other on key points, like who first cited Vinland, Bjarni Herjolfsson or Leif Erikson. Dates are fuzzy, motives are romanticized, and some events clearly lean into legend. For instance, the saga's dramatic account of Freydis Eriksdottir, who supposedly brandished a sword against hostile natives while pregnant, feels more like heroic storytelling than sober history. But that's the nature of medieval texts. They blend truth with tradition, leaving us to sift through the layers. What makes these sagas invaluable isn't just their accuracy, but their perspective. They reveal how the Norse saw themselves adventurers pushing boundaries, negotiating with unfamiliar cultures, and sometimes failing spectacularly. The tension between trade and conflict with indigenous groups isn't glossed over. It's laid bare, offering a rare glimpse into early cross-cultural encounters. And when modern archaeology confirms a saga detail like the location of a Norse hut or the use of iron nails, it's like watching a ghost step into the light. Scholars still debate how much weight to give these texts, but one thing is clear: dismissing them as mere fiction would be a mistake. They're puzzle pieces, waiting to be fitted alongside artifacts and soil layers. The sagas don't just tell us where the Vikings went. They tell us why they risked the journey, how they navigated failure, and what they dreamed of finding. In that sense, they're not just records of exploration, they're a testament to the human hunger for discovery, etched in ink and memory. Elance Orks Meadows isn't just an archaeological site, it's a time machine. Nestled on the windswept northern tip of Newfoundland, this cluster of low, grassy mounds might look unassuming at first glance, but in the early 1960s, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife, Anne Stein Ingstad, saw something others had missed. What they uncovered would rewrite history: the unmistakable remains of a Viking settlement, complete with the outlines of timber-framed turf houses, a forge for smelting iron, and artifacts that could only have come from Norse hands. Here, at last, was the smoking gun, physical proof that the sagas weren't just legends. The structures alone tell a fascinating story. Unlike the makeshift shelters of later European explorers, these were built to last, with thick turf walls insulating against the cold and carefully laid out rooms suggesting a communal living space. The presence of a forge with its slag and iron nails was especially telling. Indigenous peoples in the region weren't smelting metal at the time, but the Norse were master blacksmiths. Even small finds like a bronze cloak pin or a spindle whorl used for weaving whispered of daily life: women mending clothes, men repairing ships, the rhythm of a temporary home. But was this Vinland, the lush paradise described in the sagas? The answer is complicated. Elance Orks Meadows sits much farther north than the land of vines the Norse described, where grapes supposedly grew wild. Some scholars argue this was just a base camp, a way station for expeditions venturing further south. Evidence of butternuts, a tree that doesn't grow in Newfoundland, hints that the Vikings explored warmer regions, perhaps as far as New Brunswick or Maine. The settlement itself shows signs of being abandoned after just a few years, likely due to conflicts with indigenous groups or the challenges of sustaining a distant outpost. What makes Elance Orks Meadows so remarkable isn't just its existence, but its timing. Carbon dating places the settlement around the year 1000, exactly when Leif Erikson's voyages were said to have occurred. The alignment between archaeology and saga is uncanny, like finding a lost puzzle piece that fits perfectly. Yet the site also raises new questions. why didn't the Norse stay? Was Vinland a fleeting dream, or did they leave behind other settlements still waiting to be found? For decades, this lonely stretch of coastline has been our only concrete link to the Viking presence in North America. But with advances in technology like ground-penetrating radar and isotopic analysis, archaeologists are re-examining old clues and hunting for new ones. Every rusted nail, every charred seed, every overturned stone at Elance Orks Meadows is a breadcrumb leading us deeper into the mystery. This wasn't just a camp, it was a doorway kicked open by explorers who dared to sail beyond the edge of the known world. And somewhere out there, beneath the soil or the sea, more doors may still be waiting. The discovery of Elance Orks Meadows was groundbreaking, but it may have been just the beginning. Scattered across North America's eastern coast lie tantalizing clues that hint at a Viking presence far more widespread than we once believed. Take Point Rosy, a windswept peninsula in southern Newfoundland. In 2015, satellite imagery revealed strange soil disturbances there, straight lines and right angles that looked anything but natural. Archaeologists uncovered signs of turf walls and evidence of ironworking, hallmarks of Norse activity. But unlike Elance Orks Meadows, the findings here were ambiguous. No definitive artifacts emerged, leaving experts divided. Was this a second Viking outpost, or simply an unusual natural formation? The debate rages on, proving how elusive these transient explorers can be to pin down. Then there's the Newport Tower in Rhode Island, a circular stone structure that's fueled speculation for centuries. Its design bears a striking resemblance to medieval Norse churches, with its distinctive arches and cylindrical shape. Some argue it could be the remains of a Viking-built chapel, possibly from an expedition led by Leif Erikson or others venturing south from Vinland. But skeptics point to colonial records suggesting it was constructed in the 17th century by early English settlers. Without clear archaeological evidence linking it to the Norse, the tower remains an enigma, a ghost of possibility that refuses to be fully dismissed or confirmed. Further north, along the coast of Maine, a single Norse coin minted during the reign of King Olaf Kyrre was unearthed at the Native American settlement of Naskeag Point. Dated to between 1065 and 1080, it's the only pre-Columbian European artifact ever found in the region. How did it get there? Trade with indigenous peoples? A lost Viking explorer, or perhaps just a later European item that found its way into older layers of soil? The coin alone can't prove a settlement, but it whispers of connections we're only beginning to understand. What makes these sites so frustrating and fascinating is the nature of Viking exploration itself. Unlike later colonizers, the Norse didn't come to build empires. They were seafarers moving lightly across the landscape, leaving few permanent marks. Their settlements were often seasonal, their structures built to be temporary. After centuries of weathering and human activity, the traces that remain are like footprints in sand, easily erased by time. Even at Elance Orks Meadows, the evidence was nearly missed, buried beneath layers of peat and overlooked for generations. Yet the search continues, driven by new technologies and stubborn curiosity. Ground-penetrating radar, chemical analysis of soil samples, and even satellite archaeology are opening fresh avenues for discovery. Every potential site, whether confirmed or contested, adds another piece to the puzzle, because if the Vikings reached Newfoundland, how much further might they have gone? Down the coast of Nova Scotia, along the river systems of New England, the Sagas speak of multiple expeditions, of ships that sailed beyond Vinland's borders. Perhaps somewhere out there, beneath the earth or the sea, lies another Elance Orks Meadows waiting to be found, a silent witness to journeys we're only beginning to map. The secret to Viking exploration wasn't just courage or curiosity, it was their ships. Picture a longship cutting through the waves, its slender frame riding the swell like a seabird. These vessels weren't just transportation, they were masterpieces of medieval engineering, designed to conquer both the open ocean and shallow rivers with equal grace. At first glance, their construction seems almost contradictory, light enough to be carried across land if needed, yet sturdy enough to survive the North Atlantic's fury. The key lay in their clinker-built design, where overlapping wooden planks were riveted together, creating a hull that flexed with the waves instead of fighting them. Imagine a piece of woven fabric tight enough to hold its shape but with give to absorb impact. That's how these ships handled storms that would snap a rigid hull apart. But flexibility was only half the story. The Vikings understood the sea like no one else in their time. Their ships featured a shallow draft, letting them glide effortlessly into bays, up rivers, or even onto beaches. No deep harbors required. This wasn't just convenient, it was revolutionary. While other cultures relied on fixed trade routes, Norse explorers could go anywhere, from the Mediterranean's calm waters to the icy fjords of Greenland. And when the wind died, oarsmen took over, their rhythmic strokes propelling the ship forward even in dead calm. The combination of sail and oar meant Vikings were never at the mercy of the elements. They could pivot from raiding to trading to exploring in the span of a single voyage. Then there was the dragon-headed prow, more than just a symbol of intimidation. Carved and often detachable, these figureheads served a spiritual purpose, warding off evil spirits during treacherous crossings. The ships themselves were named like living things: Ormrin Langi, the Long Serpent, Hugin Thought, and Munin Memory, reflecting their importance in Norse culture. Every detail, from the woolen sails treated with animal fat for waterproofing to the adjustable mast that could be lowered for river travel, was honed through generations of trial and error. What's truly astonishing is how little these designs changed over centuries. A ship buried at Gokstad in Norway around the year 900 could have sailed alongside Leif Erikson's fleet 100 years later with no trouble. That consistency speaks volumes when you've perfected a tool that lets you cross oceans, raid fortified cities, and discover new continents. Why reinvent it? Modern reconstructions like the Sea Stallion, a replica that sailed from Denmark to Ireland in 2007, prove just how capable these ships were. Even today, with all our technology, watching a longship surge through choppy waters is enough to make you wonder, did the Vikings possess secrets we've still yet to fully understand? Imagine standing on the deck of a Viking longship, the horizon an unbroken line in every direction, no landmarks in sight, just open ocean stretching endlessly. How did Norse sailors manage to cross thousands of miles of treacherous waters without compasses, maps, or any of the tools we take for granted today? Their secret wasn't magic, it was an intimate, almost poetic understanding of nature itself. Take the sunstone, a mysterious tool mentioned in the Sagas. Scholars believe it was likely a piece of calcite or cordierite, crystals that polarize light. On overcast days when the sun was hidden, a navigator could hold the stone up to the sky, rotating it until the light passing through it aligned in a specific pattern. This revealed the sun's position even through thick clouds, a Viking-era GPS. Experiments with replicas have shown it startlingly accurate, narrowing the sun's location to within a few degrees. Combine that with a simple sundial, and suddenly you've got a reliable way to hold your course even when the sky refuses to cooperate. But the sun was only part of the equation. At night, the stars became their roadmap, Norse navigators memorized the positions of key constellations, using them like celestial signposts. The North Star fixed in the heavens was especially crucial, their true north in every sense. Unlike other stars that wheel across the sky, it remains nearly motionless, offering a constant reference point. Sailors also tracked the sun's height at noon to gauge latitude. The farther north you traveled, the lower it hung in the sky. These weren't just observations, they were calculations embedded in generations of seafaring wisdom, passed down through chants and stories. Then there were the subtler clues, the flight patterns of birds. Seabirds like puffins and gannets venture only so far from land. Spotting certain species could signal nearby coastlines, their direction pointing the way like living arrows. Even the color of the water held meaning. Experienced sailors could read shifts in ocean currents, spotting where warmer streams met colder ones or where sediment from distant rivers tinted the waves. Whale migrations, wind patterns, the way fog gathered over certain stretches of sea, all were pieces of a vast, invisible map. Perhaps most impressive was their oral tradition. Viking navigators didn't rely on written charts. They used bearing dials, mental lists of landmarks, sailing times, and seasonal cues. A skilled navigator might recite detailed routes like poetry. Sail west from Norway until you see the high glaciers of Iceland, then follow the geese for 2 days. These weren't vague directions, they were precise, tested by countless voyages. Modern researchers have compared these oral sailing directions to actual ocean routes and found them eerily accurate, sometimes within a few miles over hundreds of nautical miles. So could these methods really guide them to America? The answer lies in the sheer repetition of their journeys. Vikings didn't just stumble upon Greenland or Vinland once. They made the trip repeatedly, refining their knowledge with each crossing. They weren't guessing, they were navigating with a system so sophisticated it feels almost like a sixth sense. In an age when most cultures clung to coastlines, the Norse dared to trust the whispers of wind and wave, turning the open ocean into a highway. Their legacy isn't just in the lands they reached, but in the audacity to believe the world could be mastered, not with gadgets, but with observation, memory, and an unshakable trust in the rhythms of nature. The sagas paint Vinland as a paradise, rolling meadows thick with wild grapes, rivers glittering with salmon, winters so mild that cattle could graze year-round. But this idyllic description creates a puzzle. Where exactly was this land of plenty? Modern Newfoundland, where Elance Orks Meadows sits, matches the archaeological evidence but not the lush details of the sagas. Grapes don't grow there, and the winters are anything but gentle. So if Vinland wasn't just Newfoundland, how far south did the Norse actually explore? Botany offers some surprising clues. At Elance Orks Meadows, archaeologists found remnants of butternuts, a tree that grows hundreds of miles south, in New Brunswick and parts of New England. This suggests the Vikings didn't just hunker down in Newfoundland. They ventured further, perhaps following the coastline like a highway, probing for resources. The sagas mention expeditions lasting weeks or months, with groups splitting off to explore. Could Vinland have been a regional name, encompassing everything from the Gulf of St. Lawrence down to Cape Cod? Some researchers think so, pointing to places like the Bay of Fundy, where tides create rich fishing grounds, or Martha's Vineyard, whose name, though coincidental, feels almost too fitting. Then there's the grape question. Wild grapes do grow along the Atlantic coast, but only as far north as Nova Scotia in sheltered areas. If the Norse truly found vines heavy with fruit, they'd have needed to sail at least that far, possibly farther. Intriguingly, a Norse spindle whorl found in Maine hints at contact, though whether it came from trade or a lost voyage remains unclear. Others argue Vinland might have been a seasonal hub, with different camps for summer and winter, explaining why the sagas describe both mild climates and snowy landscapes. The search isn't just about geography, it's about reimagining Norse exploration as dynamic and far-reaching. Unlike later European colonizers, the Vikings weren't planting flags or building cities. They were opportunists probing coastlines for resources, then moving on. A settlement like Elance Orks Meadows might have been a base camp, a staging ground for deeper forays south. If so, traces of those journeys could still lie hidden: a fire pit eroded by centuries of storms, a rusted axe head buried in a riverbank, or even a runestone waiting to be unearthed. For now, Vinland remains tantalizingly just out of reach, a blur on the map between history and legend. But with every archaeological dig, every re-examination of the sagas, the picture grows clearer. Maybe Vinland wasn't a single spot but a mosaic of discoveries, a fleeting chapter in a story that stretched farther than we ever imagined. The truth is out there, scattered along the coast, whispering in the rustle of grapevines and the rush of northern rivers. And the hunt, it's far from over. The moment the Norse first glimpsed the indigenous peoples of North America, two worlds collided, not just of geography, but of culture, technology, and ways of life. The sagas call them skraelings, a term layered with mystery, likely derived from an Old Norse word meaning dried skin or possibly small, referencing their lighter hide clothing compared to Norse woolens. These encounters, fleeting yet profound, offer glimpses into a chapter of history where neither side fully understood the other, yet both were irrevocably changed. Trade came first, born of mutual curiosity. Picture the scene: Norse traders holding up bolts of woven cloth or gleaming iron tools, while indigenous hunters offered pelts of beaver and fox. Walrus ivory, highly prized in Europe, may have passed hands, a commodity the Norse could later trade in Greenland or Iceland for supplies. The sagas describe these exchanges with awe, noting how the skraelings valued red cloth above all, a detail that hints at cultural preferences we can only guess at today. But trade was more than commerce. It was a fragile bridge between worlds, built on gestures and tentative trust, yet misunderstandings simmered beneath the surface. The Norse, accustomed to hierarchical societies, may have misinterpreted indigenous social structures, expecting chieftains where none existed. Conversely, the skraelings likely saw the newcomers' metal weapons and towering ships as both wondrous and threatening. When conflict erupted, as it did in the saga's account of Leif Erikson's death, it wasn't mere brutality. It was the inevitable friction of two peoples with no shared language, no framework to navigate differences. The Norse, outnumbered and far from home, couldn't sustain prolonged hostilities. Their retreat from Vinland wasn't just about violence. It was a realization that this land, for all its abundance, wasn't theirs to claim. Archaeology adds haunting layers to these encounters. At Elance Orks Meadows, a single indigenous arrowhead was found near the Norse huts. Was it lost in trade or left behind in a skirmish? Elsewhere, Norse artifacts like broken iron nails have turned up in indigenous sites, repurposed as tools or talismans. These silent objects speak volumes. Contact was real, sporadic, and left traces on both sides. What's often overlooked is the indigenous perspective. While the sagas center Norse experiences, oral traditions among the Mi'kmaq and other coastal peoples tell of hairy men from the sea, suggesting these meetings lingered in collective memory. Some scholars even speculate that indigenous knowledge of the Norse may have spread inland, shaping later encounters with European explorers. These fleeting meetings were a preview of what would come centuries later, a prelude to the age of colonization with all its promise and peril. But unlike later chapters, the Viking presence in North America left no lasting conquest, no rewritten maps. Instead, it left something subtler, a reminder that history isn't just about who discovered whom, but about the messy human moments in between, where curiosity and fear, trade and conflict, all wove together in a tapestry we're still unraveling today. The story of Vinland's abandonment isn't just about failure. It's a lesson in the brutal calculus of survival. Picture the Norse settlers, thousands of miles from home, facing a dilemma: stay in a land of plenty but growing danger, or risk the perilous journey back to Greenland's meager safety. The sagas hint at escalating tensions with the Skraelings, clashes that turned trade into warfare. A single arrow killed Thorvald Erikson. Other skirmishes left Norse outposts vulnerable. With no reinforcements and dwindling numbers, holding Vinland became impossible. But conflict wasn't the only force pushing them away. Isolation gnawed at their resolve. Greenland's eastern settlement, their nearest community, lay over 1,000 miles of open ocean, a voyage that could take weeks in good weather or end in disaster if storms struck. Ships were precious, crews finite. Each trip to Vinland drained resources, and maintaining even a small settlement required a steady flow of supplies: iron for tools, livestock for food, timber for repairs. The sagas mention voyages carrying timber back to Greenland, revealing how vital this lifeline was. Yet every ship sent to Vinland was one less defending Greenland's own struggling colonies. The math was cruel but clear. Vinland's riches weren't worth the cost of keeping it. Then there's climate change, the silent player in this drama. The medieval warm period, which had made Norse expansion possible, was waning. By the mid-12th century, the Little Ice Age began its slow creep, cooling the North Atlantic and choking sea lanes with pack ice. Voyages grew riskier, storms more frequent. Greenland itself was becoming harsher, its pastures shrinking under colder skies. For the Norse, already stretched thin, Vinland slipped from a promise to a gamble. The sagas speak of later attempts to return, but none took root. The window had closed. What's striking isn't just that they left, but how cleanly they vanished. Unlike later European colonies, the Norse left no lasting mark on the land. No mixed populations, no enduring trade networks. America remained untouched by Europe for centuries, its indigenous cultures free to evolve without outside interference. That absence speaks volumes. The Vikings weren't conquerors here. They were visitors, outmatched by distance, climate, and circumstance. Their legacy wasn't conquest, but a fleeting glimpse of what might have been, a road not taken, buried under centuries of snow and silence. Yet their departure raises a haunting question: what if they'd stayed? If even a handful of Norse had weathered the storms and clashes, might Vinland have become a permanent foothold? Would later European explorers have found not an undiscovered world, but one already shaped by centuries of Norse influence? History offers no answers, only the quiet certainty that on some windswept shore, the ghosts of those abandoned longhouses still whisper what could have been. Greenland wasn't just a colony, it was the proving ground that made Viking voyages to America possible. When Eric the Red landed on its icy shores in 985, he didn't find an empty wilderness. The island's southern fjords offered something precious: pockets of grassland where Norse settlers could graze livestock, sheltered harbors for their ships, and access to walrus hunting grounds that became economic lifelines. This was no temporary outpost. Within decades, Greenland's eastern and western settlements grew to nearly 5,000 people, complete with stone churches, trade networks stretching to Europe, and a culture stubbornly clinging to European traditions despite the isolation. But Greenland's greatest role wasn't as a home, it was as a launchpad for the impossible. From these remote fjords, ships set out across the Davis Strait toward lands even more distant. The journey to Vinland wasn't some desperate gamble. It was a calculated expansion from an already thriving frontier. Greenlanders had honed survival skills that made transatlantic voyages feasible, learning to read ice patterns from Inuit hunters, adapting farming techniques to short growing seasons, and stockpiling dried fish and walrus meat for long sea journeys. When Leif Erikson sailed west, he wasn't just exploring, he was extending a network that began with his father's settlement. Greenland provided the resources, the knowledge, and most importantly, the mindset that nowhere was too far to reach. Yet this same colony that enabled America's discovery would itself become a cautionary tale. By the 1400s, Norse Greenland was empty, its farms abandoned, its churches silent. The causes read like a checklist of collapse. A cooling climate during the Little Ice Age shortened growing seasons, while sea ice choked off vital trade routes to Europe. Norse settlers clinging to dairy farming despite failing pastures showed less adaptability than their Inuit neighbors, who thrived on seals and whales. Trade, the lifeblood of Greenland's economy, dried up as elephant ivory from Africa replaced walrus tusks in European markets. Even their identity worked against them. These were Europeans trying to replicate a Scandinavian lifestyle at the edge of the Arctic, refusing to adopt the fur clothing or kayak hunting techniques of the Inuit. The cruel irony: Greenland's demise severed Europe's tenuous connection to North America centuries before Columbus. Without resupply from Greenland, Vinland became unreachable, its memory fading into saga and legend. The last recorded ship to reach Greenland arrived in 1410, a Norwegian vessel blown off course, its crew astonished to find the settlement still clinging to existence. Within decades, even they were gone, leaving only stone ruins and a lingering question. If Greenland had endured, might the Norse have returned to American shores, rewriting history? Instead, the path they pioneered vanished with them, as if the North Atlantic itself had swallowed the evidence whole. What remains today are whispers in the soil, the bones of Norse livestock in midden heaps, the outline of a bishop's crozier carved into a church wall, the rusted blade of a knife left where it fell. These fragments tell us Greenland was never just a stepping stone. It was a mirror, reflecting both the audacity and the fragility of Viking expansion. The settlers who once gazed west toward Vinland couldn't know their fate, but their story holds a warning. Even the boldest adventures depend on the threads that bind them home, and when those threads snap, the map folds in on itself, leaving only echoes behind. In 1898, a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Oman made an astonishing claim while clearing trees on his Minnesota property. He'd unearthed a slab of gray sandstone covered in strange markings. When translated, the inscriptions told a dramatic tale. A group of Norse explorers had ventured inland from Vinland in the year 1362, only to meet tragedy. The so-called Kensington Runestone became a sensation, seemingly proof that Vikings had penetrated deep into North America centuries before Columbus. But here's the problem: nearly every expert who's examined it agrees the stone is a clever fake. The runes mix archaic and modern forms, the language reads like a pastiche of Old Norse and Swedish, and the carving shows no signs of weathering you'd expect from an artifact buried for 500 years. Even the story itself feels concocted. Why would Vikings trek over 1,000 miles inland to Minnesota when coastal resources were abundant? Yet the runestone's allure persists, fueled by a potent mix of local pride and our collective hunger for hidden histories. Think about it. What's more thrilling than imagining rugged Norse adventurers standing on the shores of the Great Lakes, their longships reflected in waters no European would officially discover for generations? It's the same impulse that draws us to legends of Atlantis or lost cities of gold. We crave narratives that append the textbooks, that whisper of forgotten chapters. And in places like Minnesota, where Scandinavian heritage runs deep, the Kensington Stone isn't just an artifact. It's a cultural emblem, a way to stitch immigrant identity into the ancient tapestry of the land. But romantic notions can't override evidence. Modern archaeology offers no support for Viking presence in the Midwest, no Norse tools, no settlement remains, no corroborating accounts in indigenous oral traditions. Even the geography defies logic. The stone was found far from navigable rivers, in an area dense with swamps and forests that would have been impassable for explorers relying on water routes. Contrast this with Elance Orks Meadows, where every nail and hearth fragment aligns perfectly with Norse technology and radiocarbon dating. That's how real archaeology works. It's not about single dramatic finds, but patterns of evidence that interlock like puzzle pieces. The Kensington Runestone's endurance tells us less about Vikings and more about ourselves. It reveals how history becomes myth, how wishful thinking can shape stones into stories. And ironically, by clinging to debunked tales, we risk overshadowing the genuine marvel of Viking achievements, their real voyages, their actual settlements, their true legacy as some of history's most daring explorers. The truth is astonishing enough without inventing extra chapters. After all, isn't it more remarkable to know that 1,000 years ago, against all odds, Norse sailors truly did cross an ocean and walk the shores of a new world even if they never made it to Minnesota? Genetic evidence is the silent witness of history, written not in sagas or runestones but in the very building blocks of life itself. When it comes to Viking contact with the Americas, DNA offers a tantalizing, if ambiguous, clue. In 2010, a study made waves when it analyzed mitochondrial DNA from Icelanders and found a lineage that traced back to indigenous American origins, dating to around the year 1000. The implication: a Norse woman may have brought a Native American companion back to Europe centuries before Columbus. But like so much in this puzzle, the story isn't that simple. Later research suggested this genetic link might have come from later European colonization, muddying the waters. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between discovery and doubt. On the other side of the Atlantic, scientists have combed through the DNA of indigenous populations from Greenland to the Great Lakes, searching for traces of Norse ancestry. Among the Inuit of Greenland, some genetic studies show faint European markers that predate Columbus, hinting at possible intermingling during Viking expeditions. But here's the catch: these signals are incredibly rare, often just a whisper in the vast genetic tapestry. Without more evidence, it's impossible to say whether they came from fleeting encounters or later European contact. Even in Newfoundland, where Elance Orks Meadows stands as concrete proof of Viking presence, no genetic trail has yet been found in local indigenous groups. The challenge is separating signal from noise. Over centuries, waves of European colonization reshaped the genetic landscape of the Americas, making it nearly impossible to isolate Viking DNA from later mixtures. Imagine trying to find a single drop of ink in a river. It's there, but diluted beyond recognition. Some researchers argue that if Norse contact left any genetic legacy at all, it would be so small as to be statistically invisible. Others hold out hope that as DNA analysis becomes more precise, we might yet uncover hidden threads tying these two worlds together. What makes this search so compelling isn't just the science, it's the human stories behind it. If even one Norse explorer or indigenous traveler crossed the cultural divide permanently, their descendants would carry that history in their cells. The sagas speak of trade, of conflict, of fleeting alliances. Could they also hint at deeper connections now lost to time? Until technology unlocks clearer answers, genetic evidence remains a tantalizing maybe, a shadow on the edge of history, waiting to step into the light. The main penny is one of those artifacts that blurs the line between history and mystery, a tiny silver coin no bigger than a fingernail, minted in Norway during the reign of King Olaf Kyrre. Found in 1957 at the Naskig Point Archaeological site in Maine, it's the only confirmed Norse artifact ever discovered in the United States outside of Newfoundland. At first glance, it seems like definitive proof of Viking contact deep in North America. But dig deeper and the story gets murkier. The coin was nestled among thousands of Native American artifacts, dating between 1220 and 1280 centuries after the Norse abandoned Vinland. So how did it get there? One theory suggests trade networks stretched far beyond what we've assumed. Indigenous peoples along the Atlantic coast were known to exchange goods over vast distances. A Norse trader might have bartered the coin to a Thule or Dorset hunter in Labrador, who then passed it south through generations of exchange until it reached Maine. It wouldn't be the first time an object traveled farther than its makers ever did, but skeptics point out the coin was found alone, with no other Norse materials nearby. If Vikings had reached Maine, wouldn't there be more a tool, a weapon, even a second coin? Without corroborating evidence, the Maine penny feels less like a smoking gun and more like a stray puzzle piece, hinting at a picture we can't quite see. Then there's the Yarmouth rune stone, discovered in 18112 in Nova Scotia. Carved with what appears to be Norse runes, it's been hailed as evidence of Viking exploration along Canada's eastern shore. But like the Kensington Runestone, its authenticity is hotly debated. The markings are crude, the language oddly modern, and the stone's provenance shaky. Most archaeologists dismiss it as a 19th century hoax, perhaps carved by Scandinavian settlers nostalgic for their heritage. Yet true believers argue that erosion could explain the irregular carvings, and that the stone's placement near a natural harbor aligns with Norse sailing routes. The controversy around these artifacts reveals a deeper tension in archaeology, our desire for discovery versus the discipline's demand for rigor. A single coin or carved rock can't rewrite history on its own. Real breakthroughs come from patterns like the butternuts and iron nails at Elance Orks Meadows, which together paint a coherent picture of Norse presence. Isolated finds, no matter how tantalizing, risk becoming distractions, pulling focus from the fuller, richer story archaeology is piecing together. That's not to say every outlier should be dismissed. Science advances when we question the boundaries of what's known. Maybe future digs will uncover the missing links that connect these scattered artifacts into a clearer narrative. Until then, they remain ghosts at the edges of history, whispers of contact, trade, or perhaps just the relentless human urge to leave a mark, however small, on the vast canvas of time. The sagas don't just whisper of Viking women waiting ashore. They roar with stories like Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, a woman who crossed the Atlantic, gave birth in Vinland, and later made a pilgrimage to Rome. Her tale shatters the image of Norse expeditions as male-only ventures, but Gudrid wasn't an exception. She was part of a pattern we're only now beginning to see clearly. Take the grave in Birka, Sweden, where archaeologists unearthed a skeleton surrounded by swords, shields, and 2 horses, a burial fit for a warrior. When DNA analysis revealed the bones belonged to a woman, it ignited fierce debate. Was she a fighter, a strategist, or a symbolic figure? The truth might be all three. Viking society wasn't the testosterone-fueled caricature of old Hollywood. Women could inherit property, divorce, and wield influence as priestesses or traders. So why wouldn't they sail west too? Settlement required more than muscle. It demanded skills women had honed for generations. Picture a Viking camp in Vinland. Men might clear land or hunt, but women preserved food, stitched sails, treated injuries, and forged social ties with indigenous communities through trade. Norse women were the keepers of practical knowledge, from fermenting fish to brewing ale that staved off scurvy. Gudrid's journey underscores this. After her husband's death in Vinland, she didn't retreat, she remarried, helped lead a new expedition, and later recounted her adventures to scribes, ensuring her place in history. Women like her weren't passengers, they were pillars of survival, turning fleeting camps into potential homes. Then there's Freydis Eriksdottir, Erik the Red's daughter, whose saga blurs the line between legend and reality. When her Vinland expedition faced attack, she's said to have bared her chest, grabbed a sword, and rallied her fleeing men by shaming their cowardice. Historians debate the tale's accuracy, but its persistence hints at a deeper truth. Norse culture remembered women as active participants in exploration, not just bystanders. Even the artifacts tell this story. Spindle walls found at Elance Orks Meadows prove women were there, spinning wool to mend clothes or trade with indigenous peoples. These small, overlooked objects speak louder than any saga proof that Vinland's story wasn't written by men alone. The bigger question isn't whether women joined these voyages, but how their presence shaped them. In Greenland and Iceland, Norse women often managed farms while men were at sea or raiding. That self-reliance would have been vital in Vinland, where every hand mattered. And let's not forget the quiet power of cultural exchange. A Norse woman trading wool for furs might have shared more than good stories, child-rearing practices, even recipes. These intangible exchanges left no ruins, but they're the glue that binds societies. So why does this matter? Because history isn't just about who held the sword. It's about who kept the fires burning, who passed down the stories, who turned foreign shores into something like home. The Viking Age wasn't a man's world. It was a world where women stood on the decks of longships, gazed at new horizons, and whispered to their children about lands beyond the sea. That's the real Vinland legacy, not just discovery, but the human tapestry that made it possible. The same seas that carried Viking longships to new worlds were shaped by forces far beyond their control, the very climate itself. Between the years 900 and 1300, a climatic anomaly known as the medieval warm period draped the North Atlantic in milder temperatures, shrinking pack ice and calming storm tracks. For Norse explorers, this wasn't just weather, it was an invitation. Iceless fjords meant safer harbors in Greenland. Warmer summers extended growing seasons, allowing settlements to thrive where frost once ruled. Even the wind patterns shifted, carving reliable sailing routes west. The Vikings didn't just conquer these waters, they rode a wave of climatic luck, their golden age of expansion mirroring the Earth's own quiet transformation. But climate giveth and climate taketh away. By the late 1300s, the Little Ice Age began its slow creep, dragging temperatures down like a curtain closing on an era. Glaciers in Greenland advanced, swallowing pastures whole. Sea ice thickened, turning once navigable straits into deadly labyrinths. The sagas tell of ships vanishing, not to raiders or reefs, but to rogue icebergs and sudden squalls. A journey from Norway to Greenland, once a matter of weeks, became a gamble with the elements. Supply lines frayed, then snapped. The last recorded ship from Europe to reach Greenland arrived in 1410, its crew stumbling upon a colony already withering on the vine. What's striking isn't just the climate's impact, but how the Norse responded or failed to. In Greenland, settlers clung to European farming traditions, raising cattle even as pastures shrank. They wore wool in a land where their Inuit neighbors thrived in sealskin, their pride perhaps as frozen as the seas around them. Meanwhile, indigenous communities adapted, shifting diets to seals and whales, embracing flexible survival strategies. The contrast is haunting, one culture bending with the wind, the other breaking beneath it. Yet climate alone didn't doom the Vikings. It was the collision of factors, cooling temperatures, disrupted trade, and cultural stubbornness, that turned challenge into crisis. Walrus ivory, Greenland's economic lifeline, lost value as African elephant tusks flooded European markets. Church tithes meant for Greenland's bishop instead languished in Norwegian ports, their ships unable to pierce the ice. Even Vinland, that fleeting foothold in the west, might have offered refuge had the Norse sustained it. But retreat became the only option, their once mighty ships now prisoners of a changing world. This story isn't just about Vikings, it's a lesson in fragility. The same seas that raised them up became their jailers, proving that no civilization, no matter how bold, is immune to the whims of nature. Today, as we face our own climatic reckoning, their legacy whispers a warning. Adaptation isn't just survival, it's the difference between memory and monument. The North Atlantic remembers their ships but not their stubbornness, and that may be the most enduring lesson of all. The Norse didn't just explore, they traded. Across the icy waters of the North Atlantic, their ships carried more than warriors. They were floating marketplaces laden with walrus ivory, furs, and the grim cargo of enslaved people. These goods fueled an economy stretching from Greenland's frozen shores to the bustling markets of Europe and the Middle East. But when it came to their North American ventures, trade wasn't just an afterthought, it might have been the entire point. Vinland's lush forests offered something scarce in Greenland and Iceland: timber. Norse settlers relied on wood for everything from shipbuilding to roof beams, and the sagas mention voyages specifically for gathering this precious resource. Imagine crews felling towering oaks and pines, loading longships until their hulls sat low in the water, then making the treacherous return trip to Greenland, where a single tree could mean the difference between a repaired ship and a stranded settlement. This wasn't casual foraging, it was organized resource extraction, a seasonal operation timed to avoid winter storms, but timber wasn't the only draw. The sagas speak of grapes and self-sown wheat, suggesting other tradable commodities. Wild grapes could be fermented into wine, a luxury item in Norse society, while furs from North America's abundant wildlife, beaver, fox, even black bear, would fetch high prices in European markets. Then there's the enigmatic vinbur, often translated as grapes but possibly referring to cranberries or other berries, which could have been preserved for trade or as anti-scorbutic remedies for long sea voyages. The real question isn't whether the Norse traded in Vinland, but how far their networks extended. Did they exchange goods with indigenous peoples, as they did briefly before tensions flared? The presence of butternuts at Elance Orks Meadows hints at travel further south, where such trees grew, and where trade opportunities might have been richer. Even the layout of the site suggests a workshop area with evidence of ironworking and woodworking, as if the camp was less a settlement and more a staging ground for processing goods. Yet trade alone couldn't sustain Vinland. Unlike Greenland, where walrus ivory created a niche economy, North America offered no single high-value commodity to justify permanent outposts. Timber was vital but bulky, furs were lucrative but required peaceful relations with indigenous hunters. Without a steady flow of high-demand goods, Vinland remained a seasonal operation, a footnote in the Norse economy rather than a new frontier. This doesn't diminish their achievement. The Vikings didn't just raid and conquer, they calculated, adapted, and exploited economic opportunities with the same ruthlessness they applied to battle. Their fleeting presence in North America may have been less about conquest and more about the oldest human motivation: the pursuit of profit, one shipload of timber at a time. History remembers Christopher Columbus as the man who discovered America in 1492, his 3 ships forever etched into textbooks and holidays. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The Vikings walked those shores 5 centuries earlier. So why does one explorer get parades while the other lingers in the footnotes? The answer isn't about who arrived first, it's about who stayed in the story. Columbus had timing on his side. His voyage coincided with Europe's explosive age of empires, when Spain and Portugal were carving up the globe. Royal courts funded chroniclers to record their conquests, printing presses spread their triumphs, and the Catholic Church blessed their missions. Columbus didn't just find land, he returned with maps, gold, and a narrative Europe was hungry to believe, that they'd claimed a new world. The Norse, they had sagas, oral tales shared by firelight, their achievements scribbled in manuscripts that gathered dust in Icelandic monasteries. Without a powerful backer to amplify their story, Vinland became a rumor, then a myth. Then there's the brutal reality of contact. Columbus's arrival triggered an unbroken wave of colonization. Ships kept coming, settlements took root, and indigenous civilizations faced annihilation. The Viking stay was fleeting, their footprints washed away by time. Elance Orks Meadows wasn't a beachhead for conquest. It was a way station abandoned within years. No continuous trade, no converted natives sending word back to Europe. Just a few families who left little more than broken nails and hearth ashes. Lasting discovery requires more than stepping ashore. It demands changing the world for better or worse. But perhaps the deepest reason lies in what each culture valued. Columbus brought back gold, enslaved people, and the promise of empire, things that made kings sit up and take notice. The Norse returned with timber, furs, and stories of scralings. Useful goods, yes, but not the stuff of legends in a Europe obsessed with wealth and converts. Even their name for America, Vinland, land of vines, felt mundane next to Columbus's grand claims of Cathay and the Indies. The Vikings explored, the Spanish exploited. And history, it seems, rewards the latter. Yet today, as we reassess these stories, the Norse legacy offers something profound, a vision of exploration without immediate destruction. Their brief contact with indigenous peoples, while not without conflict, lacked the genocidal scale that followed Columbus. Maybe that's why their tale was forgotten. It didn't fit the narrative of conquest we've clung to for centuries. But in a world reckoning with colonialism's dark legacy, the Viking story feels newly relevant, not as a footnote, but as a road not taken, a reminder that discovery doesn't have to mean domination. The question isn't who deserves credit, it's what we choose to celebrate and why. For centuries, the Viking voyages to America lived in the shadowy realm between myth and history, whispered about in old Norse sagas, dismissed by scholars as fanciful tales. The turning point came not with a single revelation, but through decades of painstaking work by linguists, historians, and archaeologists determined to separate legend from fact. It began in the 1830s when Danish scholar Carl Christian Raffen published the first systematic study of the Vinland sagas, arguing they described real places in North America. But without physical proof, his theories were met with skepticism. The breakthrough required someone willing to treat the sagas not as fiction, but as treasure maps, clues waiting to be tested against the landscape itself. That person was Helge Ingstad, a Norwegian explorer with a unique combination of skills. A former governor of Greenland who had lived among the Inuit, Ingstad understood Arctic survival and indigenous oral traditions. More crucially, he recognized something others had missed, that the saga's descriptions of Vinland's geography matched Newfoundland's northern coast. In 1960, armed with this insight, Ingstad and his wife Anne Stein, an archaeologist, began methodically surveying the area around a place called Elance Orks Meadows. Local fisherman George Decker led them to overgrown mounds that looked unnatural, too straight, too angular to be natural formations. What they uncovered would silence the doubters, the unmistakable outlines of Norse-style turf houses, identical to those in Iceland and Greenland. But discovery was just the beginning. Anne Stein's meticulous excavations over 7 seasons revealed iron nails forged in Norse-style furnaces, a bronze cloak pin, and even a stone oil lamp, all artifacts alien to indigenous cultures of the region. Radiocarbon dating placed the site around the year 1000, precisely when Leif Erikson's voyages were said to have occurred. The clincher came with the discovery of butternut shells, a tree that doesn't grow in Newfoundland, proving the Norse had ventured further south. Every layer of soil, every artifact, wove together with the Saga's accounts until the truth became undeniable. The Ingstad's work faced fierce resistance initially. Prominent archaeologists scoffed at the idea of Norse presence in North America, some dismissing the site as a Basque fishing camp. But science doesn't bend to opinion. When renowned archaeologist Birgitta Wallace joined the team, her analysis of the artifacts, particularly the distinctive Norse ironworking techniques, sealed the case. By 1978, UNESCO recognized Elance Orks Meadows as the first confirmed Norse site in North America, a watershed moment in archaeological history. What makes their achievement so remarkable isn't just the discovery itself, but how it transformed our understanding of history. Before Elance Orks Meadows, the idea of pre-columbian transatlantic contact was relegated to fringe theories. Afterward, it became irrefutable fact. The Ingstads didn't just find ruins, they bridged the gap between oral tradition and physical evidence, proving that sometimes the old stories hold truths waiting to be unearthed. Their legacy reminds us that history isn't set in stone. It's a puzzle always inviting us to look closer, dig deeper, and question what we think we know. The Norse may have abandoned Vinland, but whispers of their voyages never fully faded from Europe's collective memory. In the hushed corners of Icelandic monasteries, scribes preserved the Sagas, their pages crackling with tales of lands beyond Greenland. Basque whalers who fished the same icy waters as the Vikings centuries later might have traded stories in coastal taverns, tales of distant shores passed down like heirlooms. Even Christopher Columbus, during his stay in Iceland in 1477, could have heard echoes of these legends. The evidence is circumstantial, but the possibility tantalizes. Did the ghost of Vinland linger in the back of explorers' minds, nudging them westward? Consider the Basque connection. By the 1400s, these skilled mariners were hunting whales as far north as Labrador, overlapping with Old Norse sailing routes. Some historians point to shared fishing grounds near Newfoundland, where Basque and Viking boats might have crossed paths centuries apart. Could a weathered runestone on a distant shore, or a half-remembered tale traded over barrels of salted cod, have seeded the idea of lands across the Atlantic? There's no smoking gun, no diary entry or map bearing Norse markings, but maritime cultures thrive on oral tradition. Secrets of the sea rarely die, they just change shape with each telling. Then there's Columbus himself. The Genos explorer's personal library included works by medieval scholars who referenced Norse expeditions. One book, Historia Rerum Ubique Gestarum, described Viking-style peoples living in the far northwest, a detail that might have flickered in Columbus's imagination as he plotted his own voyage. Of course, he wasn't searching for Vinland, his eyes were fixed on Asia. Yet the idea that lands lay beyond the horizon wasn't pure fantasy. It was buried in Europe's subconscious, a half-forgotten truth waiting to be rediscovered. The real Viking legacy isn't in proving who knew what, but in how exploration builds on itself. Every voyage, failed or successful, tightens the weave of human knowledge. The Norse didn't just leave behind turf houses and iron nails, they left a psychological threshold crossed. Once someone proves a journey is possible, others will follow, not because they have a map, but because the doubt is gone. That's why Vinland matters. It wasn't just a settlement, it was a beacon, however faint, shining across 5 centuries of silence. The Vikings didn't need to hand Columbus a compass. They'd already done something far more powerful. They'd made the impossible feel inevitable. Picture this: a crew of modern-day adventurers standing on the deck of a Viking longship replica, the wind snapping at the sail as they plunge through the same icy waters Leif Erikson once navigated. This isn't just a thought experiment, it's experimental archaeology in action. Ships like the Snorri, a painstakingly recreated Norse vessel, have become floating laboratories, testing every detail of Viking navigation from sunstones to star path. When these replicas successfully reach Newfoundland, it's more than a triumph of sailing. It's a validation of centuries-old ingenuity, proving the sagas weren't just stories, they were manuals. One of the most revealing experiments came in 1998, when the Snorri set sail from Greenland to North America, using only traditional Norse methods. No GPS, no modern charts, just a crew relying on the same tools the Vikings had: the sun's arc, the flight of seabirds, and the subtle shifts in ocean currents. The journey was brutal. Storms battered the ship, fog swallowed the horizon for days, and fatigue gnawed at the crew. Yet when they finally glimpsed the rocky shores of Newfoundland, the significance was undeniable. The Vikings hadn't just survived these crossings, they'd repeated them, often with families and livestock in tow. The Snorri's voyage didn't just retrace history, it revealed the sheer physical and mental stamina required to pull it off. But experimental archaeology goes beyond sailing. Researchers have tested everything from Viking iron forging techniques to the durability of turf houses in North Atlantic winters. At Elance, Orks Meadows, reconstructions of Norse buildings show how tightly woven sod walls insulated against biting winds, while open hearths kept interiors livable even in deep frost. These aren't just museum displays, they're functional spaces where historians live for weeks, cooking over fire pits, mending clothes with bone needles, and sleeping on benches lined with furs. The goal: to experience the rhythms of Viking life firsthand, uncovering nuances no artifact alone can reveal. Perhaps the most striking insight from these experiments is how improvised Norse exploration must have been. Replica voyages often encounter unexpected hurdles: a snapped oar, a torn sail, a sudden squall forcing crews to adapt with whatever's on hand. The Vikings didn't have contingency plans, they had resourcefulness. When the Snorri's mast cracked mid-journey, the crew lashed it together with ropes, mirroring repairs described in the sagas. These moments of crisis become revelations, showing how Norse seafarers turned setbacks into solutions, their ships not just transport but extensions of their own resilience. What makes these reenactments so compelling isn't just their accuracy, it's their humanity. Straining at the oars for hours, squinting at the horizon for landfall, or huddling in a smoky longhouse, modern participants gain an empathy no textbook can provide. They feel the ache of muscles pushed to limits, the thrill of spotting a distant coast, the quiet awe of standing where the Vikings stood. It's one thing to read about Vinland. It's another to sail into its fog-shrouded bays, knowing every wave beneath the hull is one they too once rode. These experiments don't just confirm the sagas, they breathe life into them, transforming faded ink on parchment into salt spray and creaking timbers. And with each successful voyage, the line between past and present blurs, reminding us that history isn't just something we study, it's something we can, for a fleeting moment, live. Vinland's saga has leapt from the pages of medieval manuscripts straight into our modern imagination, morphing into everything from blockbuster films to comic book arcs. Marvel's Thor comics and the Vikings series on the History Channel might take liberties with horned helmets, a myth the Norse themselves never wore, but they've done something remarkable. They've dragged Viking exploration out of dusty textbooks and into living rooms everywhere. Take the 2007 film Pathfinder, which reimagined Norse warriors battling indigenous tribes in a fictionalized North America. While historians cringed at the timeline and armor choices, the movie's very premise, that these two worlds collided, lodged the idea of pre-columbian contact into pop culture's bloodstream. But not all adaptations play fast and loose with the facts. The 2022 Netflix documentary Vikings, Valhalla wove Vinland into its storyline, grounding its portrayal in real archaeology. When Leif Erikson appeared on screen, he wasn't just a caricature swinging an axe. He was a navigator reading the stars, a man torn between his father's legacy and uncharted horizons. Even the show's depiction of Norse ships, sleek, oar-powered, and terrifyingly agile, borrowed directly from museum replicas. It's a delicate dance. Too much fantasy and the history evaporates. Too much rigor and the drama flatlines. The best retellings strike a balance, using creative license to ignite curiosity without erasing the truth. Then there's the quieter influence, the ripple effect of Vinland in novels like The Sea, Rowed by Margaret Elphinstone, or Jane Smiley's The Greenlanders, which immerse readers in the sensory world of Norse exploration. These stories don't just recount events, they conjure the smell of salt-crusted wool, the ache of frostbitten fingers, the quiet awe of standing on an unknown shore. They remind us that history isn't just dates and artifacts, it's the grit under someone's nails, the choices made in desperation, the stories whispered to keep fear at bay. Yet pop culture's greatest gift might be its ability to ask what if. Video games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla let players roam a stylized Vinland, trading with virtual Skraelings or battling mythical beasts. It's not accurate, but it's infectious, a gateway for players to Google the real Elance Orks Meadows mid-quest. Even History Channel's The Curse of Oak Island has dabbled in Viking speculation, linking Norse explorers to the island's infamous money pit. These theories often crumble under scrutiny, but they spark conversations, turning barroom debates into deep dives down archaeological rabbit holes. The danger, of course, is when myth overshadows reality. Too many depictions still peddle the old tropes of mindless berserkers or lone wolf explorers, ignoring the communal pragmatism that defined Norse society. But the counterbalance is here. Podcasts like the Norse Mythology blog dissect pop culture's hits and misses, while YouTube historians like Dr. Jackson Crawford translate sagas with a scholar's precision and a storyteller's flair. The result, an audience that knows Vinland wasn't just a Hollywood set piece, but a real place where real people made impossible choices. So let's not begrudge the dramatizations. However flawed, they're keeping the Vikings' voyages alive in the collective imagination, ensuring that each generation rediscover the wonder of those transatlantic journeys. The next time a kid builds a longship out of Legos or a gamer pauses to read a Vinland lore snippet, remember, pop culture isn't just entertaining, it's the modern mead hall where these ancient stories keep getting retold. The hunt for Viking footprints in North America isn't confined to history books. It's a living, breathing quest, fueled by cutting-edge tech and relentless curiosity. Picture archaeologists sweeping dense forests with LiDAR, lasers piercing through centuries of overgrowth to reveal unnatural mounds or straight lines hidden beneath the foliage. This isn't science fiction. It's how researchers recently identified potential Norse structures at Point Rosie in Newfoundland. While the site remains controversial, it's a testament to how much landscape still hides secrets waiting for the right tools or the right pair of eyes to uncover them. But LiDAR is just the beginning. Ground-penetrating radar peers into soil without disturbing a single blade of grass, mapping buried hearths or post holes invisible from the surface. Isotope analysis of bones and artifacts can trace migration patterns, revealing whether a skeleton found in Maine spent childhood in Scandinavia or if a rusted axe blade was forged from Greenlandic iron. Even drone surveys are revolutionizing the search, capturing high-resolution images of coastal erosion zones where Viking-era sites might be crumbling into the sea before we ever spot them. The irony, some of the best evidence could be vanishing just as our ability to find it improves. The real challenge isn't just technology, it's rethinking where to look. If Elance Orks Meadows was a base camp, where are the seasonal hunting outposts, the riverway trading stops, the ship repair stations? Archaeologists are expanding their gaze southward, scouring Nova Scotia's bays and New England's riverbanks for traces of Norse activity. A single fire-cracked rock in the right layer of soil, a rust stain in the shape of a lost tool, or even a butchered animal bone showing distinctively Norse butchering techniques could rewrite the map. Then there's the ocean itself. Shipworms and saltwater devour wooden wrecks, but modern marine archaeology is piecing together submerged landscapes from the Viking Age. Sonar scans of the Labrador Sea might one day reveal a longship's ghostly outline preserved in silt. Even without a hull, cargo scattered across the seabed, an anchor stone, a shattered barrel of Norse nails, could pinpoint forgotten routes. What keeps this search alive isn't just the thrill of discovery, it's the unresolved questions. Why did the Norse abandon Vinland so completely? Did they leave behind genetic or cultural legacies among indigenous peoples? And could other European cultures, the Irish, the Basques, have followed their wake before Columbus? Every excavation, whether it yields a trove of artifacts or just ambiguous stains in the dirt, tightens the weave of this thousand-year-old mystery. The story of Vikings in America isn't a closed book. It's a manuscript with half the pages still uncut, each new find a sentence waiting to be read. The Vikings didn't just cross oceans, they crossed boundaries of what was thought possible, and in doing so, left behind a masterclass in human adaptability. Picture a Norse trader bartering with indigenous hunters in Vinland, their hands moving in gestures instead of words, or a ship's crew jury rigging a torn sail with whatever scraps they had left. These weren't just survival tactics, they were glimpses of a mindset that thrived on improvisation. The Vikings didn't conquer new lands by brute force alone. They succeeded because they observed, learned, and adjusted, whether it was adopting Inuit kayak designs for Arctic hunting or shifting trade routes when storms closed familiar passages. Their greatest strength wasn't their swords, it was their willingness to change course when the world refused to bend to their will. Yet adaptability alone couldn't shield them from every misstep. Greenland's Norse settlers clung to European farming traditions even as the climate grew harsher, their cattle starving on shrinking pastures while their Inuit neighbors flourished on seals and whales. This stubbornness, this refusal to fully adapt, became their undoing. It's a lesson that echoes far beyond the Middle Ages. Resilience isn't just about enduring, it's about evolving. Today, as we face our own uncharted waters, climate shifts, technological upheavals, the Viking story asks us a piercing question. When the old ways fail, do we double down or dare to reinvent? Then there's risk. The Norse didn't just tolerate uncertainty, they embraced it as part of the bargain. Sailing into the unknown meant accepting that some ships wouldn't return. But they weighed those odds with ruthless pragmatism. A Viking trader wouldn't risk a loaded longship in spring ice floes. Just as Leif Erikson didn't colonize Vinland blindly, he sent scouts, probed coastlines, and built temporary shelters before committing. Their courage wasn't recklessness, it was calculated daring, a blend of intuition and experience that modern entrepreneurs or scientists would recognize instantly. Every Silicon Valley disruptor or Mars mission planner stands on the same psychological ground as those Norse navigators, the willingness to venture beyond the map, but with eyes wide open. But perhaps the most striking legacy of Viking exploration is its quiet humility. For all their raids and sagas, they left no grand monuments in Vinland, no attempts to civilize the land or its people. Their footprint was light, their stay fleeting. In an age obsessed with claiming and conquering, the Norse remind us that discovery doesn't have to mean domination. They came, they saw, they traded, and when the balance tipped against them, they left. There's a modern resonance in that, a counterpoint to the wreckage of colonial arrogance. What if our own explorations of space, of cultures, of ideas carried that same respect for limits? The Vikings' voyages didn't just expand their world, they expanded humanity's sense of possibility. Every time we push past comfort zones, every time we trade certainty for curiosity, we're sailing in their wake. Their story isn't locked in the past, it's a living compass, pointing not just to where we've been, but to where we might go next. The Viking voyages to America stand as a testament to humanity's restless spirit, the unshakable urge to push beyond the horizon, no matter the cost. These weren't just journeys of conquest or survival, they were leaps into the unknown, fueled by equal parts desperation and boldness. Think of Leif Erikson's crew, their faces raw with sea spray, squinting at a coastline no European had ever seen. Or Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir, giving birth in a turf hut thousands of miles from home, her child the first known European born in the New World. These moments aren't just footnotes, they're seismic cracks in the timeline, proving history's edges are far rougher than our textbooks suggest. What makes their story so compelling isn't just the what or the when, it's the why now. Why, after centuries of silence, did the world finally listen? The answer lies in the slow, stubborn work of those who refused to let legend fade. Carl Christian Raffan poring over sagas in the 1830s, the Ingstads brushing dirt from a Newfoundland hearthstone, modern archaeologists sifting shoreline mud for a single Norse nail. Each discovery was a chorus of voices saying, "Look closer, the past isn't done with us yet," and that's the real magic here. The Viking saga isn't some closed book gathering dust on a shelf. It's alive, evolving with every LiDAR scan of a forest floor, every isotope analysis of a bone fragment. Who's to say what's still buried out there, another longhouse hidden under centuries of soil, a shipwreck preserved in the icy grip of the Labrador Sea, or even some fleeting genetic trace whispering of contact we've yet to fully understand. The thrill isn't just in what we've found, it's in what's still waiting, patient as the tides. This story also holds up a mirror to how we think about exploration itself. For too long, history painted the Vikings as lone wolves, savage adventurers carving paths through sheer force. But the truth is messier, richer. They were traders as much as raiders, diplomats as much as warriors. Their encounters with indigenous peoples, those fragile, fraught moments of trade and conflict, reveal a world far more interconnected than we ever imagined. Vinland wasn't a one-way conquest. It was a crossroads, however brief, where two worlds sized each other up and left marks that linger still. So what's the takeaway? Maybe it's that history isn't a straight line but a tangled knot of possibilities. The Norse didn't discover America. They brushed against it, left a scratch on the doorframe, and stepped back. Their legacy isn't in empires built or maps redrawn, but in the simple, staggering fact that they tried it all. And in that trying, they gave us something priceless, proof that the world has always been bigger, stranger, and more wondrous than we dare to assume. The adventure doesn't end here. Every shoreline, every artifact, every half-remembered saga is an invitation to dig deeper. Who knows what other surprises are waiting just beneath the surface? One thing's certain, the past never stops surprising those willing to listen. So keep exploring, keep questioning, because history's greatest stories are often the ones we're only beginning to tell.